What you see here is the wood that I'm going to be using for my cutting board. I have 4 species: walnut, maple, cherry, and African mahogany. Most of what I'm using will be larger offcuts from past projects, as well as one newer walnut board. And for those wanting a detailed list of all the pieces and their final dimensions, I will have plans available for purchase through the link in the description below. What you see me doing right now is just chopping and milling the boards into chunks closer to their final shape. But as we continue milling up the boards, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the design for this cutting board came to be. A little over a month ago, I received a video from one of my math teachers for back in high school, who also happened to be my very first woodshop teacher. In this video, he and his 7th grade math class were looking at some 3D drawings where he challenged them to draw and mirror the projected image. Being the talented group they are, of course they succeeded. Here are some of the students' drawings that I was sent. This is when it reminded my teacher of some of the cutting boards I had made in the past. He proceeded to show them some of my past work and then challenged me to turn their drawings into a 3D cutting board. When I received this challenge video, I began picking apart the pattern, figuring out the best way to construct it, or even if it was possible. And that brings us to where we are today. So I just finished rough milling all my lumber, and this is what we're with right now. So I'm going to let this stuff sit a few days, and then I'm going to come back, do the final milling, and start cutting pieces into their glue up dimensions. So a few days later, I planed all the boards down to exactly ½ an inch. Now if you're wondering why I suddenly jumped and dropped the board, it's because the chips moving through the hose created a static charge with the outfeed table. Let's just say it was a little shocking. To temporarily fix that, I used a scrap piece of wood to prop up the hosing, increasing the distance away from the bed, which did fix the problem. And yeah, when I say exactly ½ an inch, I mean exactly. Then it was over to the table saw to chop my boards down into shorter lengths. I opted to use my table saw as my miter saw is actually not currently functioning. With all the boards cut to length, it was time to rip the individual pieces to their final widths. Then once that was done, a 45-degree angle was cut on all the walnut, cherry, and African mahogany pieces, leaving the maple ones with two 90-degree edges. To cut these pieces, I bumped the fence closer and closer to the blade until I was cutting right along that top corner perfectly. Here I'm just trimming some of the extra length off the board so that they're all equal lengths before gluing them up. These two patterns are the same. They're going to get glued up like so. And then once those are glued up, one of these is going to get flipped and glued onto this like that. While doing these glue ups, I took extra care to make sure everything was aligned, as we'd be gluing to these surfaces in the next step, and any error would just compound itself as we continue. I also made sure to try to wipe off all extra squeeze out on the top where we would be gluing to next. While those sections were drying, I began working on the third part to this board. Just like before, I ripped their boards to their final widths before proceeding to cut a 45-degree angle, which I failed to film. Then I cut my maple pieces in half on the bandsaw to give me 4 equal pieces for the next glue up. When gluing 45-degree angles along a long strip, I learned this trick of using masking tape along the seams. This acts sort of like a hinge and helps to hold everything aligned when you glue things up. After checking everything went together properly, I went ahead and glued it like so. Once I was dry, I ran each side through the drum sander, not really removing any material, just enough to kind of clean up the surface without changing the dimensions. Since this angle isn't really the best to show you what's going on, I'll try and explain on the image in the top right. Since the bottom piece is being glued at an angle with no support, I put a small shim underneath it here to prevent it from sliding too low, while the clamps prevented it from sliding out. I could then layer the rest of the pieces up while clamping them down. After I clamped the mahogany pieces on, I went ahead and did the exact same thing for the cherry pieces. Once that was dry, I trimmed off most of the excess over at the bandsaw and then drum sanded the remaining bit down. Then it was over to the table saw to cut the 45-degree angles on these pieces. I started shallow and raised the blade a little each pass since the cut depth was so deep. Even then, I still wasn't able to do the whole thing on my table saw. I finished the cut on the bandsaw, staying back a little bit from my saw line, before smoothing that cut out with the hand plane. With that done, I squared up one edge on the bandsaw and began cutting out all the pieces for the final glue up. So the pattern will then get arranged like this. We're going to have block in each corner. And they're going to be the darker ones here, here, and here. So those are the mahogany ones. It's going to go together like this. Once the glue had finished drying, I ran the board through the drum sander to clean up my two faces. Once the drum sanding was done, it was back to the table saw to flush up all my edges. I then hand sanded everything to 220 grit before giving all the edges a 1/8 inch round over. Once all the edges had been rounded, I went back and sanded everything up to 320 grit. And with the sanding out of the way, we can move on to the last step and apply the mineral oil. And lastly, here are some shots of the finished board. And I just want to give a big thanks to my former math teacher, Derek Johnson, and of course his 7th grade students who did the drawing that inspired this cutting board. It would not have happened without them. As always, if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more videos like this one. Thanks for watching.